There is a row of low white buildings on a quiet street in Jacksonville, Florida. If you drove past them, you would assume they were somebody's old business long forgotten. Nothing about them announces really anything. They are the last surviving silent film studio in a city that once had more than 30 of these silent film studios. And the man who owned them spent 9 years doing something almost nobody else in American film was doing. He was a white filmmaker from a Florida crossroads town, and he built his entire career making movies with all black casts for black audiences. His name was Richard Edward Norman. To understand why Norman ended up where he did, you have to understand what Jacksonville was before the movies ever arrived there. My name is Beth Perdue. I'm your storyteller for today, and this is Forgotten Threads. Florida's Grand Gilded Age Hotel era began in 1869 with the St. James Hotel, built along a considerable stretch of Laura Street in downtown Jacksonville. Two men, one from Boston, one from Connecticut, put up $30,000 for it. It accommodated 500 guests. It had hot and cold baths, a bowling alley, and a billiard room. Word spread fast among the nation's wealthy that there was a warm, strange, semi-tropical place at the bottom of the country where you could spend January in short sleeves. Then came Henry Flagler. Flagler first wintered in Florida in December of 1883, and what he saw convinced him to build. He put up the Hotel Ponce de Leon in St. Augustine. Construction began in December of 1885, and it opened its doors on January 12, 1888. But the hotels were never the real machine. The real machine was the railroad. Flagler bought up a scattering of short, disconnected, narrow gauge lines running down the east coast of the state and consolidated them into a single system, which became the Florida East Coast Railway. That consolidation is the thing that mattered. Before it, Florida was a series of isolated outposts. After it, Florida was a destination, a chain of cities and attractions you could actually reach on a schedule in comfort. By the late 19th century, Jacksonville had a nickname, the Winter City in Summerland. And we have an earlier video that I've done about a trip to Florida during the turn of the century and what the rail system was like back then and how people could travel. So check that one out if you'd like to learn more. It worked so well that in 1888, California launched its own tourism campaign specifically to counter Florida's pull. Hold on to that, remember that, because California was noticing Florida. But that's not the only time that Florida was noticed by California. Disney also later on realized the benefits that Florida has in land, in year-round availability to be open, and so it brought people back. But let's get back to Jacksonville. The Jacksonville area was already a very bustling city, and it was the answer to a lot of these problems. That same year, the city opened the Subtropical Exposition, a sprawling attraction with an art gallery, two artificial lakes, a zoo, and a Seminole encampment. It opened January 12th, 1888, the very same day as the Ponce de Leon. President Grover Cleveland came to see it that January. You could reasonably call it Florida's first theme park. The opera, the art, the spectacle, entertainment had become part of the Florida product. People were already coming here to be shown things, which is exactly the habit an entire industry would later be built on. Two inventions made everything that follows possible, and they worked in opposite directions. So before we can kind of talk about film as an industry, it would help to understand a little bit more about the early days of film. And forgive me as I mispronounce some of these words. Kinetoscope, an early motion picture viewing device developed at Thomas Edison's laboratory, largely by William Kennedy Laurie Dixon in the early 1890s, a tall wooden cabinet containing a continuous loop of 35mm film running past a lamp and a shutter. The viewer looked down through a peephole, one person at a time. The first commercial kinetoscope parlor opened in New York City in April of 1894. You paid 1 nickel, you bent over the cabinet, and you watched a few seconds of film alone. It was a private thing. It was a curiosity in a box. Then 1 year later in France, cinematograph. whatever. You get the point. A hand-cranked device patented in 1895 by Auguste and Louis Lumiere that served as camera, film printer, and projector in a single lightweight unit. It threw the entire image onto a wall. A whole room could view this at one time. That is the entire difference. Edison's machine sold a moment to a person. The Lumiere's machine sold a moment to a crowd. The first public paid screening was in a Paris basement in December of 1895, and within 2 years, the technology had crossed the Atlantic and reached Jacksonville. Film arrived at the Park Opera House in Jacksonville in 1897. 4 years after that, on May 3rd, 1901, a fire that started in a La Villa mattress factory burned through 146 city blocks, roughly 466 acres. Over 2,000 buildings were gone. 7 people were dead. Thousands were now homeless. The Opera House was burnt down. It remains one of the largest urban fires in American history. Jacksonville rebuilt, though, and it rebuilt fast. It rebuilt with a hunger for money and for production and for moving past the catastrophe. Meanwhile, the Nickelodeons had exploded across the country. Cheap storefront theaters selling 3 things at once: information, entertainment, and vice. News, spectacle, and just enough disreputability to make them thrilling. But the studios producing all of that content were in New York, New Jersey, and Chicago, and Northern Production had 4 problems it could not solve. It was cold. They needed light, which has to do with the seasons as well. Film stock was slow, and sunlight was the only practical light source at the time. They needed a place also that could shoot continuously, not just 4 months a year. They needed a different environment. Every picture shot in the same New Jersey lot looks like the same New Jersey lot. Florida solved all 4 of these problems. It was warm, bright, year-round, and visually strange. It was palms and rivers and swamp that could double for anywhere, not to mention the antebellum homes, the beautiful sprawling landscape. It had everything that you needed to, cater to a variety of needs in the film industry. The Callum Company came down from New York in 1908 and opened Jacksonville's first permanent studio, becoming the first American company to shoot films year-round. More than 30 studios followed, among them Metro Pictures, an ancestor of MGM. Jacksonville had a new nickname. Mayor J.E.T. Bowden actively courted them, and it boomed. In walks Richard Edward Norman, who was born on July 13, 1891 in Middleburg, Florida, which was a small settlement in Clay County, southwest of Jacksonville. He did not begin as an artist. He began as a salesman. Around 1914-1915, Norman got into what the trade called home talent pictures, or town films. This was actually a really great idea. Norman would roll into a small town, cut a deal with a local theater owner, and shoot a short film starring the townspeople themselves. Then he'd screen it for those same townspeople who turned out in force to see their neighbors on screen, and he'd split the take with the theater. He ran this in 40 towns or more across the Midwest and the South, and it was a template, not a creation. Most of these were love stories, a couple wandering joyfully through town, ending up at a wedding chapel. But Norman also had a stock comedy script the locals could act out. His sales brochure went so far as to list the props and costumes needed to make it. These were things that people had to bring with them in order to be in the production. This is what he said: 2 dark slouch hats, 1 checkered cap, 1 auto duster and goggles, gunny sack, and local newspaper. That paint-by-number script produced the first entry in Norman's filmography, Sleepy Sam the Sleuth. His next project was the 1916 film The Green-Eyed Monster. Remember that name, it's an important movie. It was a drama built around 2 compelling railroad companies, where the green-eyed monster of the title was, of course, the almighty dollar. Like Sleepy Sam, it had an all-white cast. In full disclosure, Sleepy Sam did have 1 black character, Willie, a tattered vagabond complete with a bandana knapsack, which tells you precisely where Norman's imagination was in 1916. It was where the rest of the country was. And then something shifted. Around this time, Norman became familiar with black cinema, with directors like Oscar Mijo, and producers like the Lincoln Motion Picture Company. He was watching black filmmakers build an entire parallel industry for an audience the studios refused to see. 3 years later, after a few missteps and critically, after listening to audience feedback, Norman remade The Green-Eyed Monster with an all-black cast. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and the publicity Norman wrote for it was worth hearing in full because it tells you what he thought he was selling. The film suggests advancement of the color race along educational and financial lines, he said, and is even more interesting than the usual thrillers because of the fact that the characters were colored people, splendidly assuming a different role. With town films, soft drinks, and white comedies behind him, his professional identity was now set. Norman was the white filmmaker who made black films. This, of course, raises the obvious question, and in the book, The First Hollywood, Bean puts it plainly. Was he a dedicated racial pioneer, or had he simply found a need and filled it, which is basically the recipe for any business? Both things are true, and the evidence for both is in the same filing cabinet. Norman the businessman was intensely practical. He kept impeccable track of his earnings and expenditures. Surviving scraps of paper were filled with line after line of addition, subtraction, and long division. Food, gas, lodging, car trouble. His expenses reports read exactly like those of a traveling salesman, because that is what he was. But his son, Richard Norman Jr., described the other half. My dad, of course, was a businessman, but an underlying thought in his mind was the desire to do something constructive, to build better race relations. Through his films, he was committed to helping black players live up to their potential and show what they were capable of as performers and human beings. Well, in 1920, Norman bought a studio complex in Jacksonville. By then, it was a city that was already past its peak and ran it as the Norman Film Manufacturing Company. It was past its peak in the sense of the film industry. He wrote, produced, financed, edited, and distributed his own pictures. That degree of control was rare for anyone in the era, and he was the only race film producer in the country who owned his own studio outright. And look at what his characters were. Not the servants and buffoons the major studios were selling. His leads were bank presidents, doctors, pilots, ranchers, lawmen, and detectives. The Bulldogger Western, starring real black rodeo star Bill Pickett, and Crimson Skull from 1922. It was a Western shot partially in the all-black town of Boley, Oklahoma. Regeneration in 1923, Castaway Adventure, The Flying Ace in 1926, a very popular one, aviation crime drama. It was the greatest airplane thriller ever filmed. And in 1928, Black Gold. It was his last feature film. Now, back to the city, because the ground was already giving way. Jacksonville had grown tired of the movie people. Studios were staging chase scenes in traffic, pulling false fire alarms to get footage, and shooting riots in the street without warning anyone. The breaking point was a picture called The Clarion. The Clarion debacle involved a stage scene of civic chaos, liquor, anger, anarchy, and city servants who, as Bean in his book puts it, surrendered their sworn duty to the barrel of a Bell and Howell hand crank camera. Even the newspaper columnists, once loyal disciples of the industry, turned. They said, although Jacksonville for the past several months has been gradually becoming the motion picture manufacturing center of the Atlantic seaboard, she has never before seen the place for such scenes of violence committed in the name of silent drama. Mayor Bowden, the industry's great champion, was challenged by a young conservative Democrat named John W. Martin. Martin campaigned on a straightforward promise. He would not be ruled by the filmmakers. He would tame the movie industry. And he won. It was an easy win. At 32, he became the youngest mayor in the city's history. That election didn't just change in administration. It settled the question of what Jacksonville wanted to be. And the answer was not this, not the film industry. So why did Hollywood win when Florida had every advantage first? Well, it was partly Edison. California set a continent away from Edison's aggressive patent litigation against independent filmmakers, which made it a safer place to operate. But the deeper reason is almost funny. Jacksonville was already a city. By the time the first movie studio arrived, it was full of industry, full of citizens, full of established interest with opinions about what happened on their streets. The film business had to negotiate with space. It was not given permanently. Los Angeles was a city too, but it was nearly a blank slate. It grew up around the film industry rather than being asked to make room for it. People moved out there specifically to build an entertainment industry, the way people would later move to Central Florida to build around Disney. Jacksonville had the climate, Los Angeles had the vacancy. Norman held on longer than most, but the race film market was contracting, and then sound arrived and finished the job. Norman had invested in his own sound equipment. A competitor's system became the industry standard. Norman's became obsolete. Bankruptcy followed. And here's the last thing you need to know about him. At one point, after Norman's fall, Warner Brothers offered him a job, and he declined. He chose to hold onto Norman's studios, his home, his identity, and to produce industrial films for companies like Pure Oil instead. As the film business went dry, the buildings were put to other uses. Eventually, his wife, Gloria's dance studio, took over the production building where it stayed for 30 years. Richard Norman died in 1960. Of the roughly 8 features and numerous shorts Norman Studios produced, exactly one is known to survive complete. The Flying Ace from 1926, restored and held by the Library of Congress. And those low white buildings in Arlington are still there. On October 31st, 2016, they were designated a National Historic Landmark, the last surviving silent film studio in the city that thought it would be the first Hollywood. Norman was a businessman who counted every gallon of gas on the back of an envelope, but he spent a decade putting black doctors, black pilots, and black heroes on America's screens. And when the industry that had rejected all of that finally offered him a seat at the table, he said no and stayed home. Was he a pioneer or a man who found a need and filled it? I think it was both. I think he was a fantastic businessman who saw an industry that had a hole, and he filled it, and he did it spectacularly. He went around many obstacles, including World War I, the industry that was already past its prime in Jacksonville, and he really made something of himself. Florida was not the first Hollywood. It sounds nice and all that, but referring to Jacksonville as Hollywood isn't accurate. Hollywood didn't exist. The industry existed before the Mecca of film was created. I think some of the success of Hollywood came because it wasn't a bustling city like New York, Chicago, or anywhere in New Jersey or Jacksonville. It wasn't producing things for the war effort. It hadn't just survived a catastrophic fire. It was given the opportunity to become whatever it needed to be in order to have success. Well, thank you for joining me on this episode of Forgotten Threads. Like and follow on Facebook, share, and of course subscribe in order to be notified of the next episode.